So just so we can present our speaker tonight, as I like to say, he's a friend. He's someone just like us, working hard to get better, right? And in the walk of it, help others to get better as well. And he is a fourth generation Spiritist, born and raised in El Paso, Texas. He currently serves as a secretary of the Allan Kardec Spiritist Society of Maryland and is a public interest attorney with a medical legal partnership in Washington, D.C. With no further ado, we'll pass the word to Adrian. Adrian, please be welcome, my friend.
Sure. Thanks. So good evening, friends. Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm very excited to be here to talk about something that I know has been sort of in my heart, trying to figure out all these changes that the world is experiencing. And because of the uncertainty, sometimes we get anxious and we don't know how to process all the information that we get in the media sometimes. But as Spiritists, we know that the world is beyond just the material world and that our planet is going through a transformation. And so I'm hoping that we can understand these global challenges within the doctrine that we love and that we study. And so I'd like to start off first by quoting from an economist that I read when I was in grad school, an economist named Amartya Sen, who won the Nobel Prize, and his focus was development. And he wrote a book in 1999 at the end of the 20th century called Development is Freedom. And I don't want to sort of quote line by line, but I want to sort of paraphrase what he says in the first few pages. He says, "We live in a world of unprecedented opulence, of a kind that would have been hard to imagine even a century or two ago. Concepts of human rights and political liberty are now very much a part of the prevailing rhetoric. People live much longer on average than ever before. And yet, we also live in a world with remarkable deprivation, destitution, and oppression. There are many new problems as well as old ones: poverty, unfulfilled elementary needs, famine, widespread hunger, and worsening threats to our environment." So Sen is sitting at the end of the 20th century, and he's seeing all these problems. And since then, we've entered a new era, the information age, and the internet has brought us facility and has brought us things that we could never have imagined. But it's also brought us new challenges that only within the past few years we're really starting to understand. First, climate change and extreme weather is something that is accelerating at a rate that maybe was happening gradually, and now we feel it every year. We also see the spread of pandemics like Ebola, like Zika, like bird flu, like swine flu. And we see global financial crisis of the kind that the world had never seen before. And the internet also brings this unique opportunity to unify the planet. We saw this at the beginning of 2011 with the Arab Spring, where we saw Facebook bringing men and women across the Arab world together. But the paradox of this progress is that there have often been some unintended consequences, because on the one hand, the Arab Spring was positive in that it brought it helped people to exercise freedoms and demand their rights. But in some instances, it also led to war, to violence, and to mass migration across the globe. And so we need to take a moment to reflect on this period that we have in history. The United States National Intelligence Council recently put out a book or a paper called The Paradox of Progress. And one of the things that they said is that what they're predicting is that within the next 5 years, we have the potential to see some of the worst conflict that the world hasn't seen since the Second World War. And because of the nature of the problems that we're facing as a global community, it's going to be more and more difficult for us to cooperate to fix these problems at a time when cooperation is needed. So I'd like to first start by coming together of a working definition of global challenges. And I took a definition from an organization called Worldwide University Networks, because they're doing research on this, and they had a very concrete definition that I liked. And I'm going to read it for you, then we're going to sort of parse it out to kind of understand the elements of what a global challenge is. But it says that global challenges are the major issues facing our planet that are of such a magnitude that no one institution or organization can address on its own, and that requires the pooling and sharing of knowledge across institutions, across disciplines, and across continents. So let's just kind of break that down. So the first thing is that it's a major problem facing our planet. So we're talking about things like climate change, like weapons of mass destruction, like mass migration across the planet, by water shortages. We're not talking about small things. We're also talking about things that affect the entire planet, right? So global change is something that affects the poor and the rich. Although we have to admit that the poor and the most vulnerable, or people with other vulnerabilities, are more susceptible to the changes that we're facing. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. We're going to focus on that a lot and what our duties are in those instances. But pandemics, we're all susceptible. You're at the wrong place at the wrong time. Could get Zika, Ebola, whatever. The other thing is it's of a magnitude that not one organization or one institution can address. It's going to require humanity to come together as one to address these challenges. And it's also going to require information and knowledge across various sectors. So scientists are going to have a role to play, lawyers, doctors, philosophers for conceiving new ideas of global governance. So it's going to really require a lot of cooperation, and that's the key here. Cooperation, I think, is what we're really trying to get at. And I'd like to talk about global challenges because I like to talk about concrete things. I don't like things that are too theoretical. I like to talk about these challenges in the context of climate change, and I want to see how climate change can impact everyday people. So to do this, I want you guys to come with me on a trip to a small island nation named Sri Lanka. Out of curiosity, has anyone ever been to Sri Lanka? So what you can see from this map is that Sri Lanka is a small island nation just south of India. It's in the middle of the Indian Ocean. What you can't see from this map is that until very recently, Sri Lanka was divided by a very tragic civil war. It was a war that lost many lives, and it was a war that was senseless. It was fought between two ethnic minorities that both had very legitimate claims to the territory, and thank God those struggles have now come to an end. And the reason why I know about Sri Lanka is because in 2005 and 2006, I was working with Catholic Relief Charities, or Catholic Relief Services, for about a year and a half after the December 2004 tsunami. So what we're going to talk about is sort of some of my reflections from what I learned and what I saw in Sri Lanka at the time. I want to take you a little bit closer into the country, and I want to take you to the small town where I lived in Sri Lanka. So I'd like for us to go to the eastern coast of Sri Lanka, and it's kind of hard to see, but it's a town right here called Batticaloa. And Batticaloa is an interesting town because the name was the way the Portuguese explorers who settled there pronounced the Tamil name of the town Matakalapo, which means muddy waters. And as we zoom in a little closer into Batticaloa, you're going to know why the Tamils called it the place of muddy water. So Batti, as most people call it, is the main town. The downtown is in the middle of a lagoon. You've got the Indian Ocean on one side, and then you've got these vast networks of lagoons. It's actually gorgeous. Green, lush, a beautiful, beautiful place. And then you have, these communities that have been built up along the sandbars. So I want to take us to a small fishing village within this town of Batticaloa. And the fishing village is a little village called Navladi. And it's along this sandbar. And the people of Navladi are fishermen. They fish with these canoes on the lagoon side. These are not my photos. These are photos from BBC. And they fish in these lagoons with canoes. And they also fish in the ocean with these large nets. But because the nets are so heavy, it requires several men to pull the nets in from the sea. And so you see a team. But they're not sort of large commercial fishermen. They live off of what they catch. They sell what they catch at the local markets, and then they eat whatever surplus they have. And you can imagine it's not much. But you can also appreciate that because of where Navladi is situated, when the tsunami came, they were particularly vulnerable. These are men and women who live by the sea. They work with the sea. Their houses are up and down the coast of the lagoons and of the sea. And just to understand the way the tsunami worked, there was an earthquake off the coast of Indonesia that sent a wave cascading into the Indian Ocean. And you can see Sri Lanka was right in the path of this wave, and especially the east coast of Sri Lanka. So the wave ended up damaging the entire east coast and part of the south. The capital, Colombo, is on this side, so it really wasn't affected. But the entire east coast of the country was flattened. So what happened with Navladi is that actually it was two waves. It was not just one, it was two. So when the first wave came, the first wave washed over the entire sandbar. And this was the weaker of the two. But it was strong enough that as the wave went back into the ocean, it retracted all of the water in this middle lagoon. So people who were standing on this side of the mainland said that they had never seen the lagoon completely dry. And so the water retracted, and so what goes up must come down. The second wave that came crashed so hard that the water came all the way over the sandbar and affected these areas. And you can imagine, Navladi was flattened. Nothing was left standing. Dozens and dozens of people lost their lives. Boats, nets, houses, all of that was just washed into the sea. So for months, the families were living in shelters on the mainland. This particular shelter was at a Methodist church. But living in these shelters posed several challenges. One, they were having to be dependent on other people for all of their basic necessities because they frankly lost everything in the tsunami. Oh, hold on, what did I do, just snooze? But more importantly, so they lost their homes, they lost their boats, they lost their nets, they couldn't work anymore. But even if they wanted to work, so they knew how to fish, they didn't have public transport. I mean, they were living right on the sea. So they would get up in the morning, they'd go out and fish, come home for lunch, go out again and fish, whatever they caught. Then they would, someone would ride the bike to town and sell the fish at the market and then go back. But now that they're living in town, it was harder. And some of them were like housed further away, and it was harder for them to get back. So the reason why I say this is because even though this was a natural disaster in the sense that it was caused by an earthquake, the effects of climate change would be very similar in some instances to what happened after the tsunami. So this is not, I'm not a scientist, this is not a course on climate change, but I think we need to understand sort of the basics of climate change in order to understand how Batikalo and the village, the fishing village of Navladi, is vulnerable again. So if you'll bear with me. So I think in order to understand climate change, I think we need to understand the way the greenhouse effect works. And it's the idea that when the sun's rays come into the atmosphere, they bounce back off into space. But some of the heat gets trapped within the atmosphere. And there are greenhouse gases that help to trap the heat more. And so some of the gases that trap the greenhouse gas are gases like carbon dioxide, water vapor, and there's others. But there's a correlation that there has been an increase over the years of greenhouse gas because of our exploitation, our production of fossil fuels, kerosene and well, not kerosene, coal and gasoline, etc. So there's evidence that humans have caused the Earth to get warmer. So what effect does it have then? This warming planet? Well, one, it causes more precipitation, right? So it's going to rain more, and we're going to see more of these extreme weathers, like cyclones, which would have similar effects to what the tsunami had in Sri Lanka. We're also going to see the polar ice caps starting to melt. They've already started to melt. And if they melt enough, the sea levels are going to rise, and there's going to be coastal erosion. So for like a community like Navladi, maybe the sandbar won't be there anymore, right? Or think about farmers. One of the things that I learned when I was doing this work in Sri Lanka is that as the coast starts to recede, the water from the ocean starts pervading the groundwater. And so underneath the water, further inland, the water underneath the ground is fresh water. And as you get closer and closer to the ocean, it becomes what's called brackish, which is a combination of salt water and fresh water. But you can't drink brackish water. And then at the very ends of the coast, the water is completely salted. And so as the coast recede, people's access to fresh water also diminishes. So you can see that that's going to have an impact not only on people's own consumption, but it's also going to impact their livelihoods. People who use this water for agricultural purposes, for their livestock, etc. And the other thing about climate change is that, in some ways, yes, it does affect us all, but it's those that are most vulnerable, those that are poorest, those that are maybe disabled, that don't have the options to up and move or find some other solution to the changes in the environment. And in fact, we're seeing this, Batikalo, this is a graph from UN Habitat, and we're seeing that the average rainfall over the past 10 years by 10 years is steadily increasing in Batikalo. The same thing is happening with temperatures. The temperatures are rising in Batikalo. And the UN has done focus groups, and people are starting to note palpable changes to their lifestyle, to their livelihoods in these coastal communities. So this is just sort of, we can just take one, sort of the impacts that different changes to the environment will have. So flooding is going to lead, here we got flooding or extreme flooding. It's going to lead to coastal erosion, to water scarcity, to increased poverty, to soil erosion, food insecurity, and disease, for all the reasons that we've already talked about. So these fishermen in Navladi are definitely going to suffer as the climate starts to change. So you ask me, okay, Adrian, it's all well and good, but how does this have to do with Spiritism? How is this at all linked to Spiritism? Well, let me just organize myself here because I've not been following my script, but I would like to So I think in order for us to kind of see the link with Spiritism, we need to go to the back of the Spirit's book, and we need to look at the moral laws. And I'd like us to start with the law of progress, which is in part 3, chapter 8. And in question 776, Kardec and the good spirits are having this discussion between the state of nature and natural law. And Kardec asks, what is the state of nature? But we should kind of rewind, because Kardec in other chapters talks about what is natural law. And essentially, he distinguishes between man-made laws and God's laws. So the natural law are the universal laws throughout the universe. They're immutable. There are moral laws, there are material laws, but they're those laws that don't change. And he compares them to man-made laws, which are the ones that we change because our mores and our values change across the centuries, and so our laws adapt. But a law like the law of cause and effect, the law of work, the law of progress, the law of self-preservation, these are all natural laws that have been in place since time immemorial. So the discussion that Kardec starts with the good spirits is, what is the difference? Are the state of nature and natural law the same? And the good spirits say no. The state of nature is the primitive state. So what he's saying is that the state of nature is the way humans were when we first came out of God's creation and we started to populate the world, and we still hadn't formed societies and civilizations, and we were still hunter and gatherers. And Kardec explains, he says, human beings are not meant to live forever in the state of nature, just as they are not meant to live forever in infancy. The state of nature is transitory, and humans leave it behind through progress. Well, if progress is the state of nature, and if our duty is to evolve beyond the state of nature, then why does it cost us so dearly? Why are we seeing, as we progress, all of these global challenges? Well, first, we know that God created all spirits simple and ignorant, right? We all, without any knowledge, we all had a mission, we all had as our aim to perfect and to evolve. And we know that our evolution is going to be, our destiny one day is to be perfect spirits like Jesus. And we also know that our perfection depends on our desire and our submission to God's will. In other words, however quickly we learn to heed God's law is the amount of time that it's going to take us to progress. It's like in the Gospel according to Spiritism, when Jesus says, my yoke is light, my burden is easy. He's saying we have to be resigned to the struggles. We have to be resigned to the things that we face. We can't be fighting things that are not in our control. It's part of God's plan to help us grow sometimes through suffering. And when we can submit to God's will is when we're going to more quickly reach. And they say that, all spirits are going to evolve, but he says that some will spend the eternities for those that rebel against reaching perfection will be much longer. And then, of course, we've already said that the rate of evolution is going to differ between intelligence and morality. So I think that some of these global challenges can be explained by that we are growing intellectually, but we still have some more to grow morally. I want to move to another law, because the law of self-preservation is interesting, because it says the instinct for self-preservation was given to us because all beings must collaborate in the design of providence. So, in other words, we must be co-creators of the universe and thus contribute to the law of progress. So a lot of these advancements that we're seeing, it's part of God's will, it's part of the design. We're supposed to be advancing, right? But does it sound to you like there's some paradox there, that if in some ways the law of self-preservation justifies selfishness, if we're doing things, to preserve our own self, does it kind of sound like selfishness? And I think Kardec says no. He gives us clues to what are the limits to that self-preservation. And one of the things he says is that first we find out that one of the limits of self-preservation is that the instinct for self-preservation is purely mechanical, and in others it is thought out. Now, what does he mean by it is purely mechanical and in others the law of self-preservation is thought out? Well, I think it sounds like to me, to use sort of like the new sort of trendy word, I think what Kardec is saying is that we need to be mindful about the way we're self-preserving, not only ourselves, but the way we're preserving our species on the planet. We need to be deliberate. We can't fall into routines. We need to be good stewards of the resources that have been entrusted to us. Another thing that it says is that, God, Kardec and the good spirits say, is that God does not consider a crime for you to seek your own well-being if it is not gained at another's expense and if it does not weaken either your moral or physical strength. So it sounds like what Kardec and the good spirits are saying is that another sort of limit to this idea of self-preservation is whether you're doing harm to yourself or harm to others. And this harm could either be physical harm or moral harm. And I think the problem is how do we know if we are actually doing harm to ourselves and others? Well, one way that we can know is starting from the beginning, is saying let's reflect, let's be more thoughtful. But in some ways, the only way that we're going to be able to know is through experience, right? So when humanity first started drilling for oil, there was really no way for us to know the impact that the use of oil and petroleum, what that was going to have on our planet. But now that we do know the impact, well, we need to think about creative ways to either mitigate the damage or adapt, or to just find some other source of energy, because we're conscious, right? And that's what the good spirits say. They say those who are sensible know the limits of self-preservation by intuition, but many recognize it by the cost of their own experience. So what can we do about climate change and other global challenges, and why should this matter to us? Well, the reality is that for many global challenges like climate change and some of the other big ones, it really needs to have change from people that have higher pay grades than us. It really needs to be more coordinated efforts among governments, among multilateral corporations, among institutions like the World Bank, amongst NGOs. But we also have a part to play. And we have a part to play materially and a part to play spiritually. So materially, we can do things by, retrofitting our house with more renewable energies, driving a car that is a hybrid, or something as simple as not wasting food or water, right? But I think the good spirits want more from us, right? And I think what they're really asking for us is that these global challenges are going to pass and are going to find the solution, or we're going to find our solutions when we engage in our own inner transformation and when we truly learn as humans to cooperate. Now, let me give you an example of what I mean. A lot of people, and I'm not here to say rightly or wrongly, but a lot of people have criticized the president for having withdrawn the United States from the Paris Accord. And they've said, oh, that was selfish, that puts America first, this and that. Those are the criticisms, right? I'm not here to tell you whether those criticisms are right or wrong, but I can guarantee you that many of those people who make those criticisms against the president in their own lives are selfish, put themselves before others, are not thoughtful, are not mindful. And so what I think we need to do is that we need to play our small role in helping to change the atmosphere of the planet. And I think there's a scene in Nosulah that really sort of captures what I mean by this. So how many people here have read Nosulah? Okay, many people. So there's a scene where Lysias, who, just to refresh your memory, if you haven't read it in a while, it had been a while since I read it. There's a scene where Lysias and André are sitting down to listen to a broadcast of some kind of transmission. It's either like a television or of a radio. And the month is August, and the year is 1939. And it's a month before Hitler invades Poland, which then puts in motion probably the worst war that our planet has ever seen, right? And all of a sudden, they're listening to this transmission, and they hear the following broadcast from a spirit colony that's towards the center of the earth. And it says, "This is Station 2 from Moragia. We continue to broadcast our colony's appeal on behalf of peace on earth. We urge all good-willed co-workers to pool their efforts in the service of preserving the moral balance of the globe." And the broadcaster signs off by saying, "Remember that the peace needs workers for its defense. Cooperate with us to the best of your abilities. There is work for everyone." And at the end of the broadcast, we see something about Lysias that we don't often see. Lysias discreetly wipes a tear away. And if you remember, this for me was interesting because Lysias was compassionate. Lysias was a hard worker. Lysias was a brother to André. But what he wasn't was dispassionate. He was dispassionate. He was always balanced. And you never see him betray an emotion the way he did. And so I wondered, why is it that Lysias, why has this message affected Lysias so strongly? Well, there's a conversation that goes back and forth between Lysias and André. And André is, in his curiosity, is very perplexed by why the spirits in the broadcast are speaking such a clear Portuguese. He thought, oh wait, I thought spirits didn't communicate in language. I thought they communicated with thoughts. Well, in the explanation that Lysias gives him, he gives a line that I think sort of summarizes a broader point that goes beyond André's just mere curiosity about how spirits communicate. And he says, Earth's humanity is made up of millions of people and is united with the indivisible humanity of the planet. In other words, what Lysias is saying is that humanity is one. And the reason why Lysias is so sad is because he knows he's going to have to reincarnate into this very planet that's about to blow itself up. And he knows as an immortal spirit that if he hasn't passed through the difficulties that the people in Europe are about to pass during the Second World War, that he might have to face that in the future. So it brings him sorrow. And I would say that that's why the fisherman in Navladi should be important to us. Because humanity is one. And if we haven't passed through this situation already, we might one day. Maybe not in this life, but in the next life. And if we're going to have to reincarnate on this planet, and we don't work now to change the atmosphere of the planet, then we're going to come back to a similar planet. Now, it's not gloom and doom, right? We know that the ultimate destiny of this planet, we know as a certainty that all of us here in this planet, in this room, and on the planet for that matter, are going to be perfect spirits. But we also know that the degree to which we reach that perfection is going to be determined by our will, by our efforts, by our strife. And so if we don't start working today, and we don't look after the most vulnerable people that these changes are affecting, then we're not doing our part to correct the imbalance on this planet. And I think that's the central message that I wanted to convey, is that global challenges are scary, but they're part of the plan, but we don't have to face them resigned, and we can do our part through our meditation, through our own personal self-study and knowledge. It's almost as if that message in 1939 from Moraggia, right before the Second World War, could be relevant even today. There's a philosopher named Michael Walzer, who happens to be Jewish, and he's got this thing that he says, and I don't know it the quote from heart, but he talks about the Exodus, the story of the Exodus, where the Jews are liberated from Egypt, and he says that it's a story at once of the freedom of the Jewish people from slavery in Egypt, but it's also a universal story of freedom for everyone and liberty for everyone. And he says that everywhere it's Egypt somewhere. In other words, on this planet, somewhere there's conditions like what the Jews experienced in Egypt. And the only way that we're ever going to break free from the bondage of slavery, to leave Egypt, is he says that we've got to hold hands and walk together. So I just want to finish by reading a quote from a geophysicist, because I think we started with talking about sort of issues that impinge on science. And I want to read a quote from a scientist who's also a believer in God. He is a brilliant scientist who came up with theories about plate tectonics and about earthquakes and how the plates are moving. And he recently was on a podcast that I listened to called On Being with Krista Tippett. Does anyone listen to On Being? Well, On Being with Krista Tippett. Wonderful. And he says, I think it makes sense for somebody like me that believes in God that the difficulties are larger now than they were maybe 2-3 centuries ago. It makes sense because we have much more possibilities. Science and technology have given us the possibility to really answer these challenging questions. This is the first time in the history of humanity that humanity has to make collective decisions, like for the climate, the energy, and so on. Humanity is discovering that it is one people and that they have the power of decision in their future. It's as if the humanity had been educated by God to arrive at a stage where it can now really take its future into its hand and decide what's really going to happen. The Neolithic and the Paleolithic were children, really. They were just struggling along. They had no vision at all of the future. But now we have the vision. We have the possibility to make the decision to change everything. What it will be, what they will do, I don't know. The answer can be wrong. The answer can be bad. But I think it's important now. It's an important new step in the history of humanity. And I think that's right. We have the power to change. We have the technology, but it's going to require us to be agents of peace and agents of change. And I want to kind of leave with this image because it shows how humanity should be working together as brothers and sisters, pulling these nets. By themselves, they're only able to catch small little fishes. But when they're united, they're able to cast these nets further out into the ocean and bring a larger catch. So I think this was an apt metaphor for what we're trying to convey. Thank you very much. And
thank you, Adrian, again for this reminder that we received yesterday. Interesting enough, I was actually talking to Sarah about this documentary that we watched at home entitled Chasing Corals, like the sea corals.
Oh, yeah.
An amazing documentary on Netflix. I invite everyone to watch because it does bring awareness on what we're talking about, the climate being, the temperature raising, in the planet, and how it not only affects the actual air that we breathe, but also the ocean, and what's doing to the corals in the ocean, which is part of our species that are in the oceans. And again, we're talking about fishing, how it affects the fishermen, and how it affects us as well, because the water is actually also getting warmer, and a lot of these corals are dying. So watch is a little bit sad in a way, but it brings a little awareness. Also, one of the things that I would like to remind everyone, and many of you probably have seen this, the huge iceberg that just broke off from our Antarctica. The size of, they mentioned, is the size of Delaware. So you can imagine a piece of ice breaking off and floating on the ocean. And that is happening because of our raising temperatures, right? So it is again, we have the technology. Things are fast right now. Things are just, comes to us in a very fast pace. And sometimes we ask, and I ask, the reason I'm saying this, because I asked last night, what can I do? What can I do now that I don't live by the ocean? There's nothing that I can do. There's nothing really I can affect directly or fast enough that will stop the 29% of the corals that just died in 2016 in the northeast part of Australia, which is actually the biggest coral reef in the world. So I know I don't want to talk too much on top of what you just mentioned, but I think it's a great awareness for all of us, right? And I ask myself, what can I do? I have my own answers. As you said, use less. Be a minimalist in the idea of, if I really need it, I'll buy it. If not, I don't buy it. Because to process something, to create something, or to build something, it burns what? Energy. Everything that we do, everything that we acquire, everything that we need burns energy. So if we don't need it, and we leave on the shelf, perhaps there'll be less needed. And perhaps the person who truly needs it will go and get it. So buy less, use less, especially water nowadays, right? And energy. So I think it's a great reminder, and we need more of this. One of the things I would like to emphasize again is the fact that we recycle things here at the SSB, and we encourage people to recycle at home as well. It's a small thing, it's a small talk, but if we're doing our part, we can actually save corals, save lives, right? So that's just a reminder that I would like to put into this, because sometimes we look at these things, it's like, okay, what can I do? There's a lot that we can do. And don't think it's minimal, because it goes a long way, right? On that note, we would like to hear from you. Have questions, comments that you perhaps have, or perhaps an example on how you contribute to this, how you can identify yourself with one of these fishermen that are pulling the net together. Yasko.
It was a very good warning for us. Divaldo Franco said once that in, I don't know, a couple of decades or that we're gonna fight each other for water, not for religion or whatever reason today we are fighting for. It's gonna be water, because all the reasons that you raised, the springs are being, devastated, so we don't have as much river water, fresh water. So when you show the effect of the tsunami, how crucial is the fresh water for everything. It's not only to drink now, but for farming, then the birds or whatever that depends on the vegetation, etc. Come to my mind, like Divaldo said, what he could do now that he thought he was not being moral to the planet Earth, to the humanity, and for himself, because he will come in 2 generations, perhaps he's gonna be reincarnating this planet Earth. So he says, well, I used to do my shaving, and while I was shaving, he says, I would leave
The water running.
the water running. And you know how much of water I was wasting? He gives a number. He says, I can shave with 1 cup or 1 glass of water. I was using 20 liters or 40 liters of water. So is our shower, especially women. We like to have a long shower, you know. So I think it's something that we could, you know, raise awareness, what we can do in everyday life. And this thing of recycling has a double edge, because there are people that think, oh, I'm recycled, so you can waste. You know, papers that you don't need to print, you print. Oh, but then I recycle, you know. So, but this is energy. It costs energy, you know, type of food, etc., etc. So I want you to tell a little bit, or if you have more comments about this water business, how challenging actually water is now.
Yeah, you know, the bottom line is that it's not my area, especially I don't know. But I think one of the biggest points that for me I got from this study was that there's so many different ways that we can make a difference. You know, when I left doing international aid work, I was very sad. I thought that I was sad that I had abandoned this international lifestyle. The reality was that it was not right for me. I was homesick, and you know, it just wasn't right for me. But I realized that there's so many ways that we can make a difference, and I think it's kind of a false dichotomy to think about work in international communities versus work here. I mean, there's work aplenty for all of us. And I think that was the central message that I got. I think the climate change and the water, I think those are vehicles for us to kind of reflect on how these scarce resources are affecting other people. And not just other people. Like my brother lives in California, and for the longest time, we're in a very serious drought, you know, and Sao Paulo too. And so I was very conscious every time that I went to go visit my brother that I would shower very quickly, and I would make a conscious effort to shower. So these things are not affecting just, you know, people on the other side of the globe. They're starting to affect us as well. And I think that's more than just, you know, the specific ways that it's affecting. But
thank you, Adrian. Anyone else who would like to ask a question? Kirsten.
Thank you, Adrian, for being here. I don't know about anybody else, but I felt like your talk went by so fast. I was like, wait, ready for more. I just wanted to say thank you for bringing more awareness to this topic, because I feel like often when we're dealing with religions and Spiritism and spirituality in general, this topic that always seems like it's relegated to everybody else, it sometimes is not often spoken about in just the spiritual arena in general. And I believe that in order for us to really fully understand the wealth of knowledge of Spiritism, we have to acknowledge and acquiesce to the fact that, you know, this earth is part of loving and understanding and appreciating spirituality, because everything around us is important. In as much as reading books on theories and ideas that are somewhat abstract, but what is tangible is so important as well. So thank you for bringing that awareness. I think it's so important that we talk more about this and not shy away from it. Thank you.
Thanks. You know, one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot, because in Allan Kardec we're doing an intro course in Spanish on Spiritism, and as I was preparing for one of the talks, I was reminded that as Spiritists, our doctrine is beautiful because it's one part religion, one part philosophy, and one part science. And often we don't talk about the scientific aspect in our Spiritist center, but we all know that we're immortal spirits that one day are going to be perfect, which means that we're going to have knowledge about everything, from scientific to things about engineering to things about music and history, etc. And so And I think there's definitely this strain within Spiritism, this strain that Kardec had, in the book of Genesis about how the planet was formed and how the planet is evolving. I think that this topic of climate change is something that's very much a part of our doctrine and something that we as Spiritists, because of that, it's more incentive for us to understand how our world works and how our actions are in fact affecting the way our planet is able to continue serving us.
Anyone else? Okay, I'll ask the final question then. Adrian, I think you did an extremely a great job as far as bringing this idea of the climate change as a challenge, to exemplify this challenge. And I think that is, for one person who has been in an area, I have actually had the opportunity to meet people from Sri Lanka, and some of the things that they mentioned to me how difficult life is in Sri Lanka, not only of the economical issues and all those things, but also the separations between castes and you name it. It's very difficult. We don't have to go into, but you lived, you faced it, and this is just an example, as you said it. But what would you describe being the effect of this challenge that is being created? When you brought more of the results of something that happened naturally, a natural disaster. But what do you think is more that we have to work on directly that would perhaps, not as a solution, but a path that we can follow, that it would not put us in this position where we see the separation of people. We see people destitute of, the basic things as water, as money, as anything that we consider the basics in our lives.
I think it's one of the things that I learned most from my time in Sri Lanka, and I think one of the most interesting things is that by the time that I had gotten to Sri Lanka, there was a small ceasefire. The civil war had been going on for at least 25 years, and there was a small ceasefire, and there was the spirit of sort of, we're in this together because the entire country was affected by the tsunami, both the Sinhalese speaking areas and the Tamil speaking areas. And so for about a year, there were no incidents. But because the people had been living in this sort of war mentality, they already had the systems in place to be able to provide the first responses. And they were able to mobilize in a way. So I was working with Catholic Relief Services, and Catholic Relief Services is a large organization. They fund projects all over the world. So I had colleagues from Catholic Relief Services that were also serving at the time in the tsunami in Indonesia and in India and in Thailand. And I would say that and our partner was always the Catholic Church, but I would say because of the conflict, the Catholic Church in Sri Lanka was so organized, and we were able to get things done so much quicker because they were used to providing that kind of humanitarian relief because of the war. And so it kind of reminds me that, like, God, we suffer, we have these hard trials that we go, but yet we also have these hidden blessings behind these troubles. And I think, I had colleagues who were Tamils, the minority that some of which had been fighting to secede, who after the tsunami, they just said, enough, I'm done with fighting. Let's just find a way for our communities to coexist. And so there was something, even through this hardship, I thought there were beautiful small lessons to learn about coexistence, about peace, about unity.
We again thank you for this beautiful reminder to live in peace, right? First and foremost. And we all can agree that this is the first time that he's coming of many, many times, right?
Thank you.
We'll pretty sure before you leave, Daniel will talk to you, right? Daniel likes to get things scheduled. Perhaps a continuation of this or a new topic that you would like to bring enlightenment to us. Thank you so much again.
Thank you so much.
At this point, I'll pass the word to Kirsten. She will go ahead and conduct us to end our evening tonight. Thank you.